The United Nations International Day in support of victims of torture falls on Saturday, 26 June, and already relevant conversations on this global problem are holding to speak out against the crime of torture and to honor and support victims and survivors throughout the world. This year's theme is We for Them, Speak Out Against Torture. Global organization Avocats Sans Frontières, that's Lawyers Without Borders France, contributes to the respect of human rights across the world, including Nigeria. It says that notwithstanding the strong international legal and political framework in place to prevent and fight torture, hundreds of thousands of victims worldwide are subjected to torture on a daily basis, whether in prisons, police stations, or detention centers, in public or secret. Angela Uwandu Uzoma Iwuchukwu is the country director of ASF France in Nigeria. She joins us now on the news and just to look at issues around torture around the world. Good to have you join us, Angela.
Thank you very much.
So there seem to torture around the world, especially among by state actors rather, is widely prohibited. But we continue to witness an uptick of cases of torture by state actors. Why is that?
Well, one of the key reasons why we continue to have prevalent use of torture, especially in the Nigerian criminal justice system, it's because of lack of accountability. So this simply means that we have torture perpetrated regularly and no one is being held to account for this. And unless perpetrators are being prosecuted, unless we begin to have instances where we hold those who perpetrate torture to account, we'll continue to have that culture of impunity where time in and time out, we're going to see that the more victims of torture we present, we're going to have essentially more victims who are being abused in the criminal justice system. This is one of the key reasons why torture continues to be perpetrated. Now, another reason is what I would call unduly prolonged pretrial detention. If you look at the statistics of the Nigerian prison or corrections, as we have it, you would see that only about 30% of detainees in the custodial centers have been convicted for the crimes for which they were brought in detention. So a huge number, about 70%, are still awaiting trial. And sometimes you can have individuals who, in some of the instances, the cases handled by Avocats Sans Frontières France in Nigeria, have had those who have had to await trial for upwards of 8 years awaiting trial. Now, this creates an avenue where human rights violations, including torture, could be perpetrated against these detainees. We argue that the earliest point that lawyers can intervene in cases, then instances of torture and also other forms of human rights violations would be reduced to the barest minimum. So these are the two major issues why torture continues to be perpetrated within the Nigerian criminal justice system. Now, the third point that I would like to raise is the fact that a lot of victims, yes, they know they have suffered, they know they have been subjected to severe pain, suffering, whether physical or mental. But a lot of victims do not know who to go to. They do not know how to begin to seek redress. And because under the Constitution, what we have is basically redress through the legal remedy mechanisms, through the enforcement of human rights mechanism, a lot of victims are unable to also afford the services of a lawyer because having these resources, one, we're talking about time, then secondly, we're talking about being able to afford the resources to be able to engage the services of a lawyer. So all these factors.
I want to get to, sorry to jump in, Angela, I will get to issues around seeking justice and compensation for victims of torture, but let's look at the fact the kind of torture that comes from law enforcement agents, which is also, we're also now witnessing an uptick around the world, whether from Nigeria to the United States. There is just several complaints about this. When you look at the NSAS protest in Nigeria last October, it was centered on brutalities by the police anti-robbery unit. So how much of that do you think how much impact do you think that has had on operations by police and other security operatives?
So from my point of view, as one who's been working on this thematic, I wouldn't say that the impact has been significant in terms of changing the attitudes or the methodologies of work of the security operatives in Nigeria. So yes, on one hand, you would say there's increased awareness and a lot of victims were able to speak up during the #EndSARS movement. But in terms of affecting the operations and the attitudes of the security agencies, I think we still haven't seen the kind of result that we're hoping to have. So it means that as we speak, torture continues to be prevalent in Nigeria and is commonly used by security agencies.
It almost seems like, when you say that, it almost seems like, why a society that has now normalized torture and then condones violence. And that I want to ask you what can be done, because it's not just enough to sympathize or empathize with victims of torture. It could be anybody. So what can be done to ensure that issues around, because there is a power dynamic when it comes to torture. So what can be done to ensure that, such impunities, especially in Nigeria, are a thing of the past?
Okay, so I like the fact that when you talk, you start out from a point of view that this is a global issue. So it is not limited to Nigeria, because essentially we're discussing International Day in support of victims of torture. It's global. But now, since we're midway in on Nigeria, it is important to note that there are some mechanisms that are already in place, at least in terms of legislation, that if implemented can help to reduce the incidence of torture. That brings me back to the my earlier point on accountability. Now, Nigeria is one of the countries that have a legal framework that has a legal framework that criminalizes torture. So in December 2017, the Nigerian president signed the Anti-Torture Act into law, but this law has not been implemented to the best of my knowledge, and because I'm working in the sector, I would know. So as long as we do not have that law being implemented, then torture would continue. And essentially what this means is that if we begin to have perpetrators of torture prosecuted for the crime of torture, then that would set an example. And that law obviously makes provision for punishment up to 25 years imprisonment for perpetrators of torture if found guilty. So if officers begin to see that it's not business as usual, that they can be held to account for their actions for brutality, excessive use of force, and for torture, then they will begin to have a rethink and will begin to see some difference with regards to their attitude.
Absolutely.
So this is one way.
And we are seeing the panel of inquiry being set up by several states to look into the issues of torture during the EndSARS protest, but we cannot continue to set up panels of inquiry for every act of torture. So something has to be done. You've talked about the ASF. How do we hold government accountable, or public state actors accountable when it comes to torture?
So again, there are various ways. First of all is to speak out, and then when we support victims of torture under the fundamental rights enforcement mechanisms. So that is one way of holding government or state actors to account, because essentially, even though the redress is going for the victim's work, you find out that sometimes the courts, like one of the cases, judgment that was delivered today in Lagos State on behalf of victim of torture, 20 million naira was awarded as damages. So this is against the government. So that way the government is being paid for the action of one of its officers. So that is one. But then secondly, back to the issue of the Anti-Torture Act, because this is for us, it's very significant, it's important. So when we begin to insist that officers should be prosecuted under this law, it's an already existing legislation. It was signed since 2017. Why is there no prosecution under this act? One would expect that with the whole wave of the EndSARS, that some of the recommendations that I expect will come out of the panels is prosecution of the perpetrators that are found, the officers that are found guilty. So they should be prosecuted. There's a law that is existing, And all we need is to show the political will to begin to prosecute these officers.
So let's look at a broader view on this, because we seem to have zeroed in on Nigeria because this is where we are now. But let's look at a broader view on this, because in some cases, victims of torture have migrated to another country while the perpetrator of that torture live in the country of origin. So what sort of, when it comes to ensuring justice for the victims, what sort of international collaboration would you expect to see? Or how do we ensure that level of international collaboration in ensuring justice?
So thank you for this question, because this helps me to talk about the universal jurisdiction when it comes to torture. Now, torture is not just a crime in Nigeria, it is an international crime. It's also categorized under crimes against humanity. So it means that the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction to try issues or cases of torture and under the Rome Statute. Now, when it comes to a perpetrator of torture relocating to another jurisdiction. Now, if that country where he or she has relocated to can actually invoke, if it has universal jurisdiction, can invoke that to try the perpetrator, even though he or she is not in the country where the act was committed. And one of the things that I would like to see is more of these instances being done, zeroing in again, of course, in Nigeria, but then in other countries, when torture occurs, for example, in areas of conflict, the sections of the United Nations Convention Against Torture is very clear. There is absolute prohibition for torture. So times of war, national security, these cannot be invoked as excuses for torture. So no matter where it occurs, international or universal jurisdiction can actually be invoked to ensure that the perpetrator is tried, even if it's not within the home country where the act was perpetrated.
And what can be done for victims of torture, just in a few seconds, because we know that there is a trauma attached to torture, whether psychological or emotional. What can be done?
So the first thing, obviously, would be, from my perspective, the legal aid. So victims of torture require legal assistance so that they can obtain redress through the judicial mechanism that is available. But also it's important to provide rehabilitation, because torture is not just physical, it could also be psychological. And a lot of victims deal with a lot of trauma resulting from the torture they have been subjected to. So victims of torture require psychological support. They require a lot of medical support post the trauma, just to deal with the trauma that they have had to endure. And then on the other hand, we, for example, are representing victims who have become impaired, they have become disabled as a result of the torture that they have endured, and some of them have lifelong. For example, we have a victim who has been, who has his limb amputated. So those will require medical intervention. So it means that we'll be looking up to the court to award compensation, but also for medical costs for example, an artificial prostate. But also he requires all victims of torture essentially require rehabilitation, which is, by the way, the theme for this year's conversation celebration in support of victims of torture. Rehabilitation is key. People have endured a lot, they've been through a lot of traumatic experience.
Right.
So it is important that they are rehabilitated.
And I hope we actually do see a broader engagement on this, collaboration by everyone. This affects every one of us. Angela Uwandu Uzoma Iwuchukwu, Country Director of ASF France in Nigeria. Thanks for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.